He's asking about settings. So this is the more generic settings question. He wants feedback on a new dynasty startup. IDPs, he already boosted them from 5 to 8. I would say great job on that. Very
Great
smart.
job.
Everyone should boost your IDPs up. Close to IDP 1, 2, 3 scoring, which is very good. That promotes defensive linemen scoring a lot, defensive back scoring a lot. So that's good. Most people seem to know the top 10 defensive names. So you've got 8 IDP players, but if people only know the top 10, you're going to have a lot of depth available to you there. Let them grab those top 10 and you scoop up the Quay Walkers of the world, probably the Bobby Wagners of the world. So then beyond that, it gets really fuzzy. It seemed to feel that the second tier of IDP scores tend to come from top defensive-minded coach teams. When one of those coaches moves around the league, his players seem to jump in stats. Is this idea correct? So he's talking about defensive coordinators or coaches who are defensive-minded. When they get into new positions, he's asking, does that seem to make sense that new players can break out? Basically, schemes and coaching, does that affect IDPs? So I'll give a quick answer to that. Absolutely, yes. One of my favorites for this year is, I don't recall his name, but the new defensive coordinator in Atlanta came from New Orleans, brought Caden Ellis with him. Our guy, Mike Sicoli, loves talking about this. And it's something I didn't realize until he reminded me of it. And stuff like that is a great indicator. And Caden Ellis is a guy I'm trying to grab everywhere. And you can get him basically for free. Rounds like 20 plus in your draft. So how do you guys react with coaching changes, defensive coordinator changes, and then guys that they either bring with them or guys that are in place who might be elevated by their styles?
So I think it is important to kind of watch where the coaching changes are taking place and what schemes they're running and all that. But at the same time, ultimately it comes down to the players that are on the field. And, you can have really great players that aren't getting the snaps because of the coach likes somebody else better.
Right.
But then you get, situations like Houston last couple of years ago where you had linebackers that were complete trash on a defensive team that wasn't super defensive minded, that were just blowing points out of your mind. So it's valuable to use as a guide, but I would in no way use it as a be all end all for trying to determine which players you're going to target. Caden Ellis is an awesome example because you saw him do it already in that scheme. But the other pieces they're in a new scheme now. So it's hard to say that what you saw last year from guys like Troy Anderson is going to be the same this year in a new scheme. Even though you've got that defensive-minded coordinator there.
True.
Yeah, I'll say where it matters is, how the defensive coaches use their players, right? So I know there are a few teams out there, right, where they rotate their defensive line a Mattingly amount, right? So like no one gets the snap percentages that they need to actually score a whole bunch, versus other defensive coordinators will just hammer them, right? So for example, Jalen Phillips comes to mind. There's a new defensive coordinator there in Miami who is notorious for not or for rotating to keep people fresh, which is both good and bad, right? So when Jalen Phillips, a big sleeper that we all seemingly love for this year, has fewer snaps to work with potentially, then he's fewer opportunities to score a bunch of points, but he's gonna be fresher, so maybe it'll be better. But also the same defensive coordinator, I'm blanking on the name, also usually has their guy. Is it Vic Fangio?
Yeah, Fangio's
there. When he was there in Denver, he has his guy, and his guy plays a whole bunch, right? So Von Miller, not a great comparison because one of the all-time greats there, but all this to be said, it's hard to get too in the weeds with defensive coaches and try to figure out what they do, other than, I'm a New England fan. Like, good luck figuring out what the Patriots do any given week, because it's all, the team they're playing against based. And Will, to your point, I often look at what teams have bad offenses, so there's a bunch of snaps for defense for the second tier IDP scores. So it's about getting the most out of players, and there's probably something there with the actual defensive-minded coach teams, but really, I don't think it's a big enough thing to specifically just go after certain people, because on those better defensive teams, there's often a lot of mouths to feed. Like the Eagles did very well with all of their defensive linemen last year. They scored a whole bunch, but I think that's more of the anomaly than something you can necessarily expect for all of those defensive-minded teams.
And when the teams lose coordinators, that so it's a somewhat important piece of the puzzle. It's not. It's definitely a factor to consider. I think it can help unearth sleepers like a Caden Ellis, who was brought by the staff over from the team. In a Vic Fangio, Jalen Phillips, we're hoping that, yes, it might be lesser snaps, but we're hoping he's more efficient and that Fangio will put him in a better position. I think it was the IDP show and the PFF guys uncovered how like whoever was there last year was like dropping Phillips into coverage, and he's a pass rusher. Like, what are you doing? So we're hoping that Vic Fangio is not that stupid and will, although Phillips might play less snaps slightly, we're hoping that the efficiency is going to tick way up because Fangio is going to be sending him after the quarterback, not covering running backs or tight ends, which is ridiculous. So those are the types of things you kind of want to look for. Again, it's a piece of the puzzle, definitely not a be all end all. So you're sort of right with that question.
And potentially, I'd be interested. Do we know who wrote this?
I don't know if I snipped the name. I didn't
Okay.
snip the name. I believe it was, well.
If you're listening to this, which you should
Somebody
be,
Birch.
I'm gonna link it back to him, so he's gonna check
cool.
it out.
I'd want to know which teams you're talking about with the defensive-minded coaches, because in my brain, just thinking about it now, a defensive-minded coach might mean they have a worse offense, which means there's more opportunities on defense, right? I'm just going through it in my brain. It's like the Patriots, not a good offense. I'm sure the Patriots defensive players, while maddeningly trying to figure out who is going to start, they did well. The Steelers, Tomlin, that's a defensive team, right?
Yeah.
The Steelers had a pretty bad offense, so there's a lot of opportunities for that defense to score points, so on and so forth. So I'd be interested to hear who you're thinking there.
Well, he's sort of asking us about this. So we talked about Caden Ellis. The Texans is a great example how, especially in a murky situation, which it was last year and it still kind of is this year, because we have a whole new regime with guys left over from last year. So usually when that's the case, you just take the cheaper of the bunch. But I really think Christian Harris is going to break out this year under a D'Amico Ryan. So it's not necessarily a D'Amico Ryan's guy, but he's kind of stuck with him. He has decent draft capital, and I think he's going to have a nice little breakout, and their offense is still going to be bad. Denver's a whole new regime. They signed Zach Allen, the defensive lineman, to a relatively large contract. I think that is a guy to keep on your radar, and he could be had incredibly late in drafts. So there's just a few of those. We will have articles with full team previews coming out very shortly as well. So I would recommend follow along with the articles, and we're going to break down and we're going to identify a lot more of those guys. But those are just a few names to throw at you there. Opportunity seems to be a big factor, just like running backs. Exactly, follow the snaps. We'll be tracking that for you all season long as well.
A la the Texans of last year, or I'm looking at the Titans of this year. Who else is going to be bad?
Aziz and Hooker are my guys on the Titans.
Earnestly, the Rams, maybe.
Ernest Jones.
You look at that defense, like you're not going to recognize near anyone on that team, but they're going to be playing a lot of defense over there. So look for that.
These are all guys we've definitely identified, probably in a lot of articles already, but those are some more names to throw at you. But right, you got to follow the snaps. The more stats, the higher percentage of snaps are on the field, the more stats typically he's asking as a question. Yes and no. We've seen a lot of times those LB2s who play 90 to 95% of the snaps next to like a stud don't always give you the stats that you would expect out of that high of a snap percentage. Thinking Nicholas Morrow playing next to Roquan Smith for half the year last year, he was still playing a crap ton of snaps and wasn't giving you much IDP wise, especially outside of just tackles. So that is a sort of yes question, but not all the time.
It's dependent on the position too. I sort of alluded to it. Like there's certain percentages you like to have hit for opportunities. Like defensive linemen, I mean, they're big boys. So like typically
Yeah.
like 70% is pretty good for them to be out there. Linebackers, you want at least 80%, especially in the deeper leagues. And defensive backs, you want pretty near 100%. And for example, it's not just the percentage; it's where they're used. So my big example, Trevin Moehrig, if you remember him over there on the Raiders,
Right.
their safety position, he played practically 100% of defensive snaps, which if you're just looking at that, you'd say, oh, he must be producing from a fantasy perspective. Right. He had 55 combined tackles, and that was it. No splash plays. That was it. He's
playing it's not center field.
Exactly. So it's important to know, you need players that are playing, obviously, but on spots or in spots on that defense where they will actually produce.